Okay, I welcome you again. Before I introduce the next panel, I express again my gratitude to the organizers and to giving us a platform that enables people from different disciplines to collaborate. I think you can be proud of yourselves. It has been a wonderful, wonderful conference. Our next panel will address memory and trauma, and which is a theme of significant importance in the context of Sayfo, because as you know, if you kill one person, sometimes you do not only kill that one person, but you destroy and kill generations coming, his whole offspring. And these traumas, these killings are repeated again and again in the memories of survivors. So we have three speakers today for this panel. Unver Chetres, I'll introduce him very briefly. I will not read the complete description of his biography for the sake of time, but just summarize. Chetres has a PhD in psychology of religion and cultural psychology at Uppsala University in Sweden. He's also deputy director Swedish research at the Swedish Research Institute in Istanbul. Chetres finished a PhD, a doctoral dissertation in 2005 on meaning and ritualization among Assyrian migrants in Sweden. He has written extensively on different topics, among others, psychology of religion, identity, youth, and borders of knowledge. Unver, the floor is yours.
I have a childhood memory with my grandfather Shu'o. I was around 7 years old. I would accompany him as he did his regular agricultural work. On the road, he would tell stories which provided the most inspiring material for my childhood fantasies. One of these stories was about the spirits of people from the past, hidden in the caves in the mountains we used to pass by. Why is the psychological dimension of trauma, such as genocide, important today? Is it not better to try to forget instead of dealing with issues that are past? No. Psychologists say, if the historical soul wounding is not effectively dealt with, each person as well as her or his descendants is doomed to experience and perpetuate various forms of psychic and spiritual suffering in the future. After all, the term psychology itself literally means the study of the soul. My ambition here is to demonstrate how a trauma such as Sayfo has ongoing effects on Assyrian individuals today when faced with new stressful situations. I will present some central concepts in psychology for understanding issues related to trauma. These concepts and their empirical findings are mainly based on Holocaust and Armenian survivors. When presenting these concepts, I'll exemplify by empirical data I have gathered on the Sayfo among both Assyrian Iraqis and Assyrian Syrians. I will also try to weave this into my own personal narrative of the Sayfo. Now, the central concepts. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest known story about trauma, experienced by a king losing his closest friend Enkidu. Since then, many attempts have been made to understand trauma. Trauma refers to, I quote, the syndrome of the survivor of extreme situations, end of quote. But trauma also impacts the future generations. Cultural trauma is defined as that phenomena occurring, I quote, when members of a collective feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible mark upon their group consciousness, marking their memory forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways, end of quote. It's impossible from the empirical data we have today to draw any conclusions on the presence of trauma among early generations Assyrians. However, What we do know is that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was very probably evident as a result of the Sayfo, was left untreated. Or was it? I have very vague childhood memories, including adults gathering at homes telling Mimre, Qole, Nahle of sorrow, also called Lavikat in Kurdish, or Qlame Ser among Yazidis, which are short stories told in rhyme and in a monotonous melody comparable to laments. As we have heard today, there are many examples of this the time after Sayfo. But whether these could have a catharsis effect remains to be studied. We don't know. We might assume. It seems that the first generation Assyrians still in their homelands had culture-specific ritualizing of the Sayfo and its consequences. More at risk are some of the Syrian refugees today, not able to re-ritualize nor reimagine the consequences of the war today. Let me give you some figures from the project I'm conducting in Istanbul right now. 31% have trouble sleeping. 53% have experienced a very difficult situation. And 33% of the Syrian refugees show positive on PTSD. And this is still the population which is not affected as largely as the one during Sayfo. Psychologists have long said that children of significantly traumatized parents inherit specific predispositions. The cortisol hormone is a product of the HPA system that regulates and responds to psychological stress. Studies show that PTSD among Holocaust survivors was associated with significantly elevated risk of dysregulation of the HPA functioning in adult offspring. General fear, fear of annihilation, distrust, social withdrawalness, suspicion, and perceiving some groups as a potential threat for own survival, found among the Assyrians from Iraq and Syria, has similarities among Holocaust survivors. Between 2011 and 2012, I conducted interviews with Assyrian Iraqis who had migrated to Sweden. 8 of them had stories about the Sayfo. Bushra, a female of 50 years of old, had heard many stories by her grandmother about the Sayfo. The grandmother was born in Turkey and experienced the war in 1915. She would tell Bushra not to trust Muslims, no matter how good they were to her. Instead, she was told to find her trust in God and in the Bible. When the latest American invasion started, Bushra could sense how people around her had changed and saw her as an outsider. That reminded her of the stories told by her grandmother with the moral not to trust Muslims. Bushra is aware of that she is passing the same lessons in life to her children, which she learned from her grandmother. I quote her, "My children didn't believe me previously. They thought that the times had changed and everything had changed. But after what happened in Iraq, they began to think that I might be right. I tried to tell them, be friends with them, but don't trust them. Don't give them everything. Don't involve them in your life," end of quote. Bushra connects what happened during the Sayfo with what is happening to her people today in a very clear way through the existential questions she is formulating, linking it to a religious dimension and to her vulnerable social position and that of her people. I quote her again, "They will be satisfied to kill us because of nothing. I read from time to time about the Sayfo, but why? Why did they kill them? It's the same now. We are always the target and the object with which they make a sacrifice. They will kill us. Why? Because we are Christians." End of quote. It's a human characteristic to remember, and as relational beings, we want to share those memories with others. Remembering can be in many forms: oral, written, images, ritualistic, among others. However, traumatic events can lead to the failure of memory, leaving the traumatic experience under an unspeakable and unknowable condition. That is a defense mechanism. Assyrians, like the children of Holocaust survivors, have memories transmitted to them, but without a personal experience. However, they're being reminded of the fear from the Sayfo through the new atrocities and traumas taking place during the recent wars. The consequence is a coercive behavior, including not letting outsiders get too close to their private spheres. By remembering the Sayfo and through the different practices related to this, Assyrians are simultaneously conducting what is called cultural work by traveling to one's parents' place of origin, producing documentaries, writing books, creating music and arts. But by engaging with their parents' traumatic past, the act of remembrance among them is also a sign of loss of history and continuity attributable to genocide, which, as described by some of the participants in my studies, has left them with only a limited knowledge of their own collective roots. Narrative is understood as an ongoing principle in human psychology through which we understand the world, create meaning, and make behavioral decisions in everyday life. That is, they are guiding us in future conditions. As in the case with the other populations, the Assyrians rework, reshape, and interpret narratives of the past from their own context at hand. An interview by Khori Naaman Bethyahuno in the recordings by Beth Sawa'i tells about atrocities, killings, destruction, all interwoven into a religious narrative, explained as due to the sins of the Christians, referring to the early Christians and St. Paul, so were the Christian Assyrians persecuted and became martyrs. While individuals tell the genocide narrative with little linguistic differentiation between the past and the present, as indicated by two concepts, death of time and death of language. They are, however, metaphors describing also the Sayfo world, such as, I quote, Urfa, the city of Abgar, being a widow, having lost its children and men and become empty. Midyat is referred to in similar ways by Galoshabo, which Simon has shown in his paper. Stories used in these narratives don't need to be experienced personally. Lineages of authorship and origins are blurred. The upshot is that it is as if the person telling the story had actually lived through the experience recounted, as in the case we see in the picture. The intergenerational silence, which has also been characteristic among post-Sayfo generations, limits the ability to express and articulate feelings of trauma linguistically. I would like to present a model adapted from psychiatric trauma interventions for how to adapt to the fact that severe life crises are part of our experiences. By understanding how we dealt with the past, we can find constructive models for how to deal with present and possible future challenges. A severe trauma affects human beings on several dimensions of life: attachment, existential meaning, role and identity, understanding of justice, and sense of security and safety. And each of these dimensions, we first need to identify the specific challenge. What kind of loss and separation, and what kind of pain and challenge to values and belief systems? On the other dimension, we need to identify what kind of risk for human life and cultural destruction, as well as what kind of human rights violations and abuses. We also need to identify the necessary social and psychological interventions for each dimension, such as how to unite families and what counseling, therapy, and healing is needed, as well as religious and political responses. Now, depending on how we and the victims deal with these first steps of challenge and interventions, we will respond either in adaptive or in extreme ways. We may either respond with functioning refugee strategies and good coping, or with fear. We might either respond with creating new meaning or alienation and loss of faith. Again, let us find inspiration to deal with trauma in the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, where it says, I quote, "It has gone on for years and has for centuries." End of quote. Thus, as Assyrians, we have the knowledge to deal with trauma through our own narratives embodied in our own social bodies. I quote again from an interview conducted by John Besawe. "The villages were empty of people. They fled to the mountains and lived in caves. Some survived and some died of hunger. Some were captured, killed, and some were slaughtered." To end with where I started, those trips with my grandfather were among the happiest moments of my childhood, yes. The stories were not told to scare, but to tell me something about the past, about people's experiences and their suffering. Today, having read books and accumulated additional information about the Sayfo, as well as having practiced new way of ritualizing the past, I view my grandfather's stories in a new light and with a different effect. I understand now that they were not made up, nor were they innocent stories to tickle a child's fantasies, but they were part of a collective remembrance of historical happenings about the Sayfo, with a concern on part of my grandfather to guide, to nurture, and to establish an act of care towards the next generation. That is actually what culture is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Enver, for your significant contribution. I'll introduce you our next speaker, Noriko Sato. Noriko Sato has completed a BA and MA in anthropology in Japan, and she completed a PhD at Durham University in the UK. She did some work on collecting and studying diplomatic documents during the French Mandate of Syria. She taught at Durham University, and currently she works for Pukyong National University in Busan, South Korea. Her research focuses on identities of diasporic communities, especially in Syria and Iraq, as well as Koreans' understanding of their history in its relation to Japan. If you're ready, then the floor is yours.
So this paper deals with 3 different communities of Syriac Orthodox Christians in Syria. And the first community is the Syriac Orthodox Christians from Turabdin who settled in Qahtaniya in the Syrian Jazeera region. The second community, it may be better to see the map. The second community is originated from Asaf, who settled in Malkiya, which is also located in the Syrian Jazeera. And the third is a community of Syrian Orthodox Christians from Urfa, who emigrated to Aleppo in 1924. Each of these 3 communities was mostly composed of the refugees who had fled from the same area in Turkey and had rebuilt their community in a particular quarters of the town where the population density of Syriac Christians relatively high. Members in each community who shared the experience of the Christian persecution in Anatolia and have gradually reconstructed their memories of persecution and the political environment of Syria where they have now settled. In this paper, I discuss how people talk about Sayfo rather than explaining what occurred in the past. I also examine how social and political environment affects the weight of Sayfo narratives. It was the member of each of the 3 communities who remembered their experience of the Christian persecution and displacement in a distinctive fashion. Moreover, both the survivors of persecution and those who had indirect experience of the event through the account of survivors and their family members, shape the memory of the event in a similar fashion. Communities whose members had shared experiences in the past have their memories shaped by everyday interactions and by experiences later in their lives. Syrian Orthodox Christian inhabitants of these three communities share their past and present experiences, and they attempt to keep alive their memories of atrocities which their ancestors experienced. Each of these three communities compose a community of memory of their historical event, which seems to have related to their attempt to establish their position in Syrian society. My talk is based on the data which I collected during my anthropological fieldwork among the Syriac Orthodox Christians in these three communities from the late 1990s till the end of the Syrian uprising. The many of the Syriac Orthodox Christians living in Qahtaniye had immigrated from Turabdi. Their narratives of the 1915 massacre show a clear distinction from written account recorded earlier. For example, the narratives of the Einwald, we mentioned this many times in this conference, and it's also given by the Christians in Qahtaniye. The framework of each person's account is almost identical, although some people remember the more details than the others. I just introduced only a part of the narratives because we have already discussed this matter a lot. And Christians barricaded themselves in a village church. A Kurdish Aga and his tribesmen gathered in the front of the church gate. The Kurds broke down the church door, which the Christians had barricaded with wooden poles. But when the Kurds entered the courtyard, the Christians had hidden in the upstairs rooms surrounding the courtyard, started to attack the Kurds. The 80 Kurds are killed there. In all, including the people from other villages, had been in Einwald for 2 months during the siege. No one can tell how they fed such a large number of people. Although Kurds and Turks had besieged the village for 2 months, the Christians did not surrender. The Syriac Orthodox Christians in Qahtaniye have a propensity of looking at the event as a war between the Christians and the Kurds. The contemporary Qahtaniye Christians describe how their ancestors were courageous fighters. Although Kurds besieged the church, they could not set foot inside it. The church is seen as a sanctuary which only these Christians were allowed to enter. The description given by the Christians suggests a fundamental belief in eminent divine justice that protects the Christians from falling to their sinful enemies, who attempt to eliminate Christians and so attack them. During this war, these Christians cooperated and strove for collective salvation for their community as a whole, rather than for themselves as individuals. The barricaded church is used as a framework for creating relations between the different. Its importance does not lie in explaining what really occurred, because there's no contradiction between the earlier account and the contemporary ones. The symbols of barricaded church emerges them to enhance their historical consciousness, to show that the difference between them and Kurds is obvious, and gives them the pride in being Syriac Orthodox Christians, who are not feeble but can defend themselves successfully against their wicked enemies. Yes. And Syriac Orthodox Christians in Malkiye describes their community's experience of the Sayfo or Furman in a similar way to the given by the Qahtaniye Christians. For both of them, the 1915 siege explains how these Christians got together and fight against the Kurds. Thus, the 1915 events take a symbolic role in explaining the boundary between the Christian and the neighboring population, in particular the Kurds, emerged. The following is the part of the historical narratives of the 1915 siege of Azov, given by the contemporary Malkiya Christians. So I just briefly see the sort of essence, it's important here. The Ottoman soldiers and Christian tribesmen who were agents of the government reached Azov. The army started to attack Christians. The Christians used the basement of their houses, where they had stored up a large amount of food and arms, and for shelter and also for returning fire. Dozens of Kurdish tribesmen and Ottoman soldiers had cannon shot coming from the direction of the Church of the Virgin Mary. Although the officials searched the church, they could not find any arms in it. The Turks and Kurds were afraid of God, and therefore this miracle was the cause of their withdrawal from Azov. It is a contemporary interpretation given by the Syrian Orthodox Christians in Malkiya, and the Virgin Mary acted as an intercessor with God to save the Christians in Azov. Both Qahtaniya and Malkiya Christians share the view of the miracle, whose importance is used to identify their community as a social entity whose unity is derived from their shared experience of the miracle in 1915. Their fortified villages are saved by the divine power, which created a boundary between them and Ottoman soldiers and the Kurds. This belief is important for the contemporary Syrian Christians in these two communities because it differentiates the Christians from Kurds and now their neighbors. And the Jazira's regional situation has effect on the constructing narratives of the 1915 persecution. Since 1962, when the Syrian regime launched an anti-Kurdish campaign with the slogan, "Saving Arabism in Jazira," 120,000 Kurds in Jazira were categorized as foreigners. Due to Arab nationalism, the position of the Kurds has become threatened by the Ba'athist regime. During the 3 decades of the regime's strong commitment to secular pan-Arabism, sectarian cleavages almost amongst Syrian citizens no longer threatened the national integrity of Syria. Thus, the President Bashar al-Assad attempted to promote religious multiculturalism, which acknowledged the idea of religious subculture, which explains the existence of distinct religious cultures in the same geographical space of Syria, where the dominant Arab Islamic culture flourishes. Such Syrian Arab nationalism incorporates the variety of religious groups which exist in Syria. Such transformation of regional politics and religious multiculturalism forced the Syrian Orthodox Christians to reconstitute their historical account of their 1915 persecution and their self-identification with their own identity. The state-sponsored national identity, which defines Syria as a religiously multicultural nation, provides Syriac Orthodox Christians with a framework in which they can claim themselves as a religious group in Syria. However, the Kurds are ethnically non-Arabs and find it difficult to obtain rights equal to that of other Syrians. Thus, the Syrian Orthodox Christians in Qahtani and Malkiya attempt to portray Kurds as others in terms of both ethnicity and religion, and set a clear boundary between them and the Kurds. The last community here. And the Syrian Orthodox Christians who emigrated from Urfa to Aleppo portrayed themselves as Urfali. Many Urfali who had experienced this emigration as children or are descendants of the immigrants. They do not know why in 1924 their community as a whole had to abandon their properties and leave Urfa. In 1921, Mustafa Kemal permitted Christians in Turkey to leave the country. This can be seen as a device for encouraging Christians to voluntarily depart from their homeland. However, in the case of the Urpalli, it was deportation. The contemporary Urpalli remember their leaders made an agreement with Turkish officials in Urfa to live there under the condition that the Turkish authorities ensure the safety of these Christians while they are exiled to Urfa to Aleppo. However, 2 years after their immigration to Syria, the elders discovered that their leaders had an agreement to leave Urfa permanently. Instead of describing their journey to Aleppo as deportation, their leaders informed Urpalli members they would temporarily move to Aleppo. It is unlikely that the handful of community leaders were able to mobilize the whole community, about 5,000 people, without saying why they are leaving. Such concealment of their memory of Urfa seems to be related to the situation when they were living in the constant state of terror. In the absence of any safe mechanisms for transmissions, people are unable to transmit their memories even to their family members or friends. Those who live in a constant state of fear are afraid they become victims of these atrocities because they may have reported someone as perpetrator in order for them to survive. In such a situation, the boundaries between victims and victimizers are blurred. According to Zeronajian, who is an Armenian pastor lived in Urfa in those days, he says, after the signing of the humiliating Treaty of Cebu by the government of Istanbul, Mustafa Kemal launched an effective military campaign to promote Turkish nationalism, which crushed any hope for non-Turks to rebuild their homes and communities. When the French infantry battalion came to Urfa in 1920, the local Turkish Muslims regarded their presence as an affront by non-Muslims. The Turks gave French an ultimatum to leave the city, but the French refused. Then, Turks immediately began to attack the French. After 2 months of fighting, the French surrendered. Also, Turks allowed the French to withdraw from Urfa peacefully. Turkish soldiers and guerrillas ambushed and killed them. The contemporary Urpalli do not remember such details of the event, although they believe their ancestors must have been afraid they might follow the same fate of Armenians in Urfa, many of whom were killed by the Ottoman government in 1915. The fragmented memories of their time in Urfa, which the author collected from the Urpalli members, suggest their community seems to have been divided. There are some taking the side of the French, but others trying to negotiate with Turkish authorities for securing their position in society. The rest kept quiet. They all lived in a constant state of fear that they may be exterminated, and were also afraid of betrayal by their community members. The connection between the community members became weakened as members are unable to trust each other. In order to maintain the unity of the community and not to rake over old ashes, after the emigration to Syria, they did not transmit their memories of their past in Turkey to their younger generations. The failure of the Urpalli to remember their history before the emigration seems to be related to the feeling that they want to forget the past when their community was about to disintegrate it. Thus, their Turkish past exists in a shadowy silence. That conclusion. Memories of these 3 communities of Syriac Orthodox Christians in Syria suggest that they do not always remember the Sayfo in the same way. Alternative versions of the past emerge when people claim new identities. They also conceal memories of Sayfo when the situation requires to do so. The Syrian version of the communal memory is produced in order for them to develop their identity as a Christian group in Syria. The Syrian version, therefore, is one of the variant forms of remembering the past, which Syriac Orthodox Christians living in different parts of the world have constructed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's wonderful to see that a scholar from Japan and South Korea is investigating happenings in Qahtaniye. And although the Sayfo has not been acknowledged yet by politically by nations, by all nations, we see that it is studied by scholars from Berlin to Japan and South Korea, and ultimately you will help us to reveal the truth. So thank you very much. I'll introduce briefly our next speaker, Thea Hello. Thea Hello is an author and an independent researcher, and she has worked on a public radio. She has worked as a public radio announcer, producer, and news correspondent. But I think most of you know her from her book, Not Even My Name. And I have read some passages of the book. I haven't read it all, and I really can recommend it. I think everybody will recognize at least something in that book. She is an activist. She became even the catalyst for the first resolution in the US, in New York State, to recognize the genocide of the Ottoman Greeks and Assyrians. And she also contributed significantly as activist to similar processes of recognition in Sweden and Armenia. Mrs. Hello has won numerous awards for her poetry and her literary and political essays. Please come and let us know what you want to know.
Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the committee for inviting me here. I'm grateful to be here. So the question was, were the Assyrians simply caught up in the attack on the Armenians due to their often close proximity to Armenian communities in Asia Minor, or were they specifically targeted? Since it was rare, if not impossible until recently, to read or hear about the genocide of the Assyrians during the Ottoman and Kemalist periods in Anatolia between 1914 and 1923, it was easy for the general public and even some scholars to conclude that the Armenians were the only ethnic Christian communities targeted in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, for decades after the genocide, any historical mention of the Assyrians concentrated on their extraordinary conquests in ancient times, their great empire and subsequent fall, and their contributions to art, architecture, science, and law. In the New York Supreme Court Rotunda, the Assyrians are depicted among the great civilizations of lawgivers. Yet during most of my own lifetime, I have been corrected many times, even by teachers, if I referred to myself or my father as Assyrian. And it's no wonder, for decades the massacres, displacements, and expulsions that took place during the final years of the Ottoman Empire where so many Assyrian communities still existed. They were known exclusively as the Armenian genocide. For the greater public, they are still known by that narrow definition. Greeks and Assyrians under Ottoman rule, when included in scholarly papers, were usually relegated to the also mentioned category of Ottoman citizens who suffered. In what can be described as a virtual final solution, one account of the period by historian and past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the IAGS, Robert Melson, writing on the Armenian genocide, went so far as to deny the very existence of Assyrians and Greeks in Anatolia when he wrote, I quote, "The Greeks and then the Balkan Christians had seceded, leaving the Armenians as the last of the great Christian minorities still under Ottoman rule," end quote. Versions of this erroneous claim were repeated 3 times in Melson's 16-page paper, thereby effectively wiping away 4 millennia of Assyrian and Greek presence in Asia Minor. With such misrepresentation by a noted professor who teaches the Armenian genocide, it should come as no surprise that young scholars come away believing that as the only Christian minority still under Ottoman rule, the Armenians were the only victims of genocide. At one IAGS conference in 2003, 2 young scholars giving papers on the Armenians and Armenian and Ottoman Empire admitted during Q&A that they had not realized Assyrians and Greeks existed in Asia Minor at the time. In fact, the erasure of the Assyrians from the record began almost immediately by Lord Bryce, when he changed the title of a report compiled from eyewitness accounts in the Blue Book from papers and documents on the treatment of Armenians and Assyrian Christians by the Turks, 1915 to 1916, in the Ottoman Empire and Northwest Persia, to the treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, 1915 to 16. Although the Assyrian accounts remained in the document, their removal from the title leaves the impression that their treatment was incidental to the treatment of the Armenians. This paper intends to briefly explore the deliberate targeting of the Assyrians and to offer a few of the possible reasonings behind the Young Turk decision to commit genocide. News articles of the time, eyewitness reports, and research in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman archives, revealed that all Assyrian groups, including Nestorians, Chaldeans, Syriac Orthodox, Catholics, were affected. As one cipher telegram from the Ministry of the Interior of the province of Van shows, as early as October 26, 1914, months before attacks on the Armenians, the Nestorians along the border with Persia were targeted. Although Persia, today's Iran, was neutral during the war, neither the Ottomans nor Russia honored her neutrality. Both governments hoped to annex Persia's Urmia region to their own territories. The document posted and translated by Dr. Racho Donev states in part, "The position of the Nestorians have always remained doubtful for the government due to their predisposition to be influenced by foreigners and become a channel and an instrument. Because of the operation and efforts in Iran, the consideration of the Nestorians for the government have increased, especially those found at the border areas with Iran, due to the government's lack of trust of them, resulting in punishment. Their deportation and expulsion to appropriate provinces such as Ankara and Konya to be transferred in dispersed manner so that henceforth they will not be together in a mass, with the proviso that the government will not undertake to provide any type of support," end quote. The wording of the telegram, which does not mention massacres, only deportation and expulsion, with a clear message that the administration feared disloyalty, may be seen by some as relatively benign, and the measure to be taken justified, i.e., fear causing extreme measures. It would be naive, however, to conclude that the motives of the Young Turks were benign. A study of the entire genocidal period beginning with the Thracian Greeks in 1913, but then the Anatolian Greeks in the spring of 1914, who were also initially displaced and denied support for their survival, suggests a kind of learn-as-you-go plan for the annihilation of the Christian communities of Anatolia, Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians. At first tentatively, without massacres, based on alleged security concerns. U.S. Ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Sr., reported that the Young Turks were so successful against the Greeks, they decided to target the other Christian races as well, the Armenians and Assyrians. Perhaps emboldened by a lack of consequences from abroad, when Greeks of Phokia were massacred in June of 1914, by 1915 attacks on Assyrians and Armenians also turned violent. On March 10, 1915, Russian Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Pavel Vedensky, found the remains, I'm quoting, of the adult Christian male population of an entire district. Hundreds of corpses were lying exposed everywhere. All were mutilated, most had been decapitated. The vice commander of Russia's First Caucasus Army, K. Matalyan, counted the corpses and came up with a total of 707 Armenians and Syriacs, or Asourias he called them, who had been murdered by Ottoman soldiers and Kurdish volunteers on the orders of the Kaymakam, end quote. On April 29, 1915, the New York Times also reported massacres of Nestorians. More than 800, I'm quoting, more than 800 native Christians have been massacred by Kurds, and not less than 2,000 have died of disease at Urmia, Persia. Dr. W.S. Vanneman, head of the Presbyterian Mission Hospital at Tabriz, who is the chairman of the Relief Committee, appointed by the American consul, wrote, "About 10 days ago, the Kurds in Salmas, with the permission of the Turkish troops, gathered all the Nestorians and Armenian men remaining there. They were held for a few days, and then all of them were tortured and massacred. Many of the women and children were taken away and maltreated," end quote. As with earlier tactics in the Balkans, leaders in the Christian communities were targeted first. Bishops and priests were particularly targeted. The New York Times goes on to report, quote, 51 of the most prominent men of this village were taken out at night to the cemetery and shot. The women and girls who could not escape were violated. This was done by the Turkish soldiers. It is practically the extermination of the Syrians, and in quotes, or in parentheses, Nestorians, and very bad for the Armenians too. The only hope is occupation by Russia, end quote. In July of 1915, Assyrians of Mardin, my father's town, were attacked. In 1915, the Assyrians in the vilayet of Diyarbakir numbered more than 102,000. Between 1915 to 1916, almost 86,000 of that population disappeared. Of the 72,500 Armenians of the Diyarbakir vilayet, 68,500 disappeared. Fearing to enter the prosperous walled city of Diyarbakir, the Vali, Rashid Bey, and his men had devised a scheme to separate the influential men and heads of big families by inviting them to meet the Vali. Around 700 of these notables were then arrested and imprisoned. Witnesses saw groups of notables being taken out in boats on the Tigris River, robbed of their gold and even their clothing, and then shot and thrown overboard. This tactic of first inviting prominent leaders to talk had previously been used against notable Serbs and Bulgarians in the Balkans. The accounts of clergy who were killed give an idea of the immense and systematic devastation the Assyrian and Armenian communities and their leaders suffered. Of the 96,000 Jacobites who disappeared in these districts, which included the vilayet of Diyarbakir, it was reported that hundreds of priests and bishops were murdered and 111 churches and monasteries were occupied and destroyed by the Kurds. Reports of priests being crucified and burned alive were numerous. In Sert, where thousands of Assyrians were massacred, tens of thousands of books from the libraries and archives of the church, once an ancient Nestorian monastery, were deliberately destroyed. Some of the books written in classical Syriac and Chaldean were rescued, which allows us to see the quality and content of the loss. The New York Times had been reporting on the massacres of both Armenians and Assyrians in eastern Anatolia since 1915. In November 1916, however, the New York Times published the following report. In an apparent effort to combat the impression that the Armenians were the only victims of the genocide that was taking place. The Armenians, I quote, "The Armenians are not the only unfortunates. The Syrians also have been decimated. There are many varieties of Syrian Christians, and they name many of them. Great numbers have perished, but no one knows how many," end quote. Throughout eastern Anatolia and northwestern Persia, Assyrians and Armenians were massacred or sent on death marches to expulsion. Murdered victims were often thrown in the village wells, which ensured that the drinking water would be poisoned. A ciphered telegram from the Ministry of the Interior to the governors of the provinces of Bitlis, dated October 30, 1915, gives permission for the settlement of immigrants, most likely Turkish immigrants from the Balkans, in villages surrounding Mardin, Midyat, and Diyarbakir. The telegram uses the word deserted to describe the condition of the villages, which had undoubtedly been populated by Assyrians and Armenians who were massacred or deported. The London Times reported that in Urmia, 150 Christian Nestorian villages have been completely plundered and burned to ashes by Turks and Kurds. Women and girls were carried off by Persians. Their homes and property were almost all taken away by neighbors. The massacres of Assyrians and Armenians would continue in 1916, as would the massacres and death marches of Pontic Greeks and other Anatolian Greeks. The final assault on Christians that brought the genocide to an end was by Mustafa Kemal's army in September 1922 in the ancient city of Smyrna. Some would extend that to 1923, and as we just noted from Norika, in Syria, when other things went on, the deportations. Of the 1.2 million Christians later transported to Greece from Smyrna, 100,000 were Armenians, 10,000 Circassians, and 1,000 Assyrians. Today, there is a small but thriving Assyrian community in Greece, descendants of those survivors. And I believe I was informed that they came from other places as well to Greece. While it's important to examine each case in depth, it becomes evident that it's also important to look at the whole picture if we are to understand the methods and reasoning used for the genocide, just as focusing solely on the Armenians has distorted the public's understanding of the period and the extent of the genocide. Focusing solely on Assyrians may leave us with the uneasy notion that the Assyrians must have done something to warrant such wrath. In fact, accusations of treason and of plotting revolt were used against the Assyrians and Armenians to encourage neighbors who had once protected the Christians to turn on them during the Year of the Sword. However, even if we concede that there were those in the Assyrian and Armenian communities who aroused the ire of the Young Turks by fighting to protect their communities, or more drastically, fighting for independence to end the centuries-old Ottoman subjugation, the question would remain: could the Assyrians have avoided their annihilation had they not entered into any kind of activity deemed to be subversive? And were accusations of treason the only motivation that pitted formerly friendly Muslims against their Christian neighbors? A number of honorable Muslim officials in Mardin and elsewhere refused to endorse the accusations of treason. Some others, although reluctant at first, succumbed to entreaties to join the massacres. U.S. Consul General George Horton, who was stationed in Smyrna from 1911 to 1917, and again from May 19 to September 22, reported that in the spring of 1914, the Aegean coast Greeks were demonized to induce the Turkish population to destroy them. Horton wrote, I quote, "Violent and inflammatory articles in the Turkish newspapers appeared unexpectedly and without any cause, so evidently inspired by the authorities. Cheap lithographs, executed in the clumsiest and most primitive manner, represented Greeks cutting up Turkish babies or ripping open pregnant Muslim women, and various purely imaginary scenes founded on no actual events or even accusations elsewhere made. These were hung in mosques and schools and set the Turk to killing," end quote. If we can compare an account of the actual killing of Assyrians with the above-mentioned propaganda, we see a striking similarity. I quote, "Pregnant women had their bellies slit open and babies taken out to be crushed like grapes under the feet of soldiers. Soldiers raped pretty girls and women in front of their families," end quote. In the end, permission to loot and the confiscation of Christian properties and wealth certainly played a role in the Young Turk motives and for gaining recruits to carry out the genocides. But that doesn't answer the more fundamental question of why the regime resorted to genocide. Horton observed that had the Young Turks kept their campaign promise of a truly multicultural, multi-ethnic federation, the worker bees, the Christians, would have taken over the hive. And the Turks knew it. Horton wrote, "Christians would speedily have outstripped the Ottomans, who would soon have found themselves in subordinate positions commercially, industrially and economically. It was this knowledge which caused the Turks to resolve upon the extermination of the Christians, end quote. In fact, German Ambassador Wangenheim reported that as early as June 24th, 1909, that the Young Turks had decided on a plan of extermination of the Christian populations. Now, this is 2 months after the deposition of the Sultan, and it was 3 years before the Balkan Wars. Some people mentioned that the Balkan Wars frightened the Turks so much that they felt that they had to do this. They had to remove the Christians. But this determination came 3 years before the Balkan Wars. A leading Young Turk ideologue, Samuel Raphael Cohen, a.k.a. Tekin Alp, summed it up when he wrote, "The real motive was the longing of the Turkish nation for independence in their own country. This theme was echoed by Ittihad Hadis, National Assembly member Ferzi, who tried to provoke reluctant Muslims in Mardin to join in the killing of Assyrians and Armenians. Ferzi admonished, I quote, "Let us get rid of the Christians so we can be masters in our own home." End quote. Exact figures of deaths in each community are difficult to ascertain. Scholars assert that approximately 275,000 Assyrians, although some people bring it as high up as 750,000 Assyrians, over 1 million Greeks, and 600,000 to 800,000 Armenians. And some people bring that figure up. Some scholars say that reached 1.5 million. If those higher figures are reached, then over 3 million Christians were slaughtered. Although reports from various sources in 1915 and 1916 referred to the Assyrians, 30 to 40 years later, it was difficult to find anyone who knew the Assyrians still existed in the modern world. Silence over the last 100 years has rendered the Assyrians, Pontic Greeks, and other Anatolian Greek victims invisible to the general public as if they had never existed, or existed only in ancient times, thereby rendering their genocide complete. Armenian scholars often claim that denial is the final stage of genocide. However, denial of the Assyrian genocide would have at least kept the Assyrians in the public consciousness. The passing of the 2007 resolution by the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which recognized the genocide of the Assyrians, Pontian, and other Anatolian Greeks as comparable to the genocide of the Armenians during the same period, has begun to end the silence and has encouraged a more detailed look at works done by Dr. Rachov Donov and David Gaunt, and I'm so happy to see so many others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insightful and emotional presentation. Now I'd like to invite the speakers to sit behind the table. The floor is now open for questions and discussion, but I urge you to formulate your questions as brief and concise as possible. I also urge you to ask questions that might be interesting for more than one person, meaning yourself. Questions that might be interesting for only one person, meaning yourself, you can ask them also during the breaks and during dinner, and ask the speakers to respond to them. Questions, comments?
The question is directed to Ms. Noriko, the Efremildas from Spain. Just a short question. Does the Asian society, like Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese, have any idea about the Assyrian people in Middle East, and how do they see this cruel reality? Once I imagine you talk with them about the topic you are dealing with, how do they feel it?
Actually, many of them do not know what occurred among the Assyrians, the Arameans, and Syriacs. However, there are a lot of particularly Japanese people. They know about what occurred in the Ottomans of Anatolia and how Christians are massacred. Yeah.
First, okay. My question goes to Ömer Şetres. Can you elaborate more on transmission of memories? Because you touched upon that, you said that this shows that the memories today is not made up. But we know that there is a reconstruction process. Can you, because it's important, one of the arguments of the denialist arguments builds on this. So they say all are constructs, and they constructed their identity even around Sayfo in the diaspora. So one question this. The second one, very briefly, what do you think the impact of the latest ISIS march, so the massacres especially happened in Iraq, Mosul and Habur River, how did it impact the memory construction?
And the first question, and I could say the social and political environment they share in the particular location in Syria or whatsoever, it's really affect the reconstruction of the memory. And I cannot say all the details, but each region I presented today has different kind of social environment. Therefore, the way of presenting the memory of Sayfo is different. And the second question now, we can look at the particularly Syrian Jazeera region. The people are more interested in identifying themselves not as a Christian group, but as an ethnic group. They hold sort of the identity as Assyrians or Armenians, and they choose a side, and of course there are other people as well. So that's a sort of the change in the present political situation.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first question is for psychology. When we watch the movie Wills with Bashir, so I'm not sure if you have watched it, Dancing with Bashir is talking about an Israeli soldier, and then after the Lebanese war, he doesn't know or doesn't remember actually if they did a massacre or not. But in the movie that they say, even so the doers of the massacres, after a while also they would forget. So now I'm on the other side. Of course we know that we remember from our lot of reasons, but do the makers of the massacres also have this psychological forgetting for what their fathers did or not? And the second question is for Noriko. Maybe you mentioned that they try to forget in Hay Siryan the dilemma, but also as we talked in the break that some people they try always to remind the community, like Malfona Abrohom Nuro, he used always to tell the people that I have pieces of evidence and go to the children and tell them that we came from Edessa because. And you said that maybe there was no Sayfo in Edessa. Actually, if we read Afram Barson in his book about Torah Abdin, so he talked about Sevrek, that how they killed the bishop and the other priests, and there were crimes. And one member of the community, Samir Qatarji, who is now in America, now he talks about it, how actually his family were killed, and of course he's crying. So I think that your study about Hay Siryan was before the current Syrian war. So was before ISIS, was before what's happening now. And now if you will check Facebook and you will find online, so now the people of this community, they are trying to revive the issue and try to remember. So my question to you, do you think that, again, as I mentioned yesterday, that the current situation of Syria would open again the question of so-called Sayfo in Edessa?
I also refer to Söner's question. I think they kind of intertwine. I think the best way to respond to that, memory, at least from some ways of understanding, is not a fixed entity in the brain that you just can find or you just have. You have to construct the memory. And you do that by going back in terms of stories, in terms of acts, practices, etc. So I think when you approach that concept, you have to define what you mean by memory, and that is probably the best way to deal with that kind of questions as you are referring to. So and that's the way I define it also. It's not a fixed entity, but it is being constructed, it's being filled in. You have an emptiness, but you have to fill it with material. And that is how you construct, you remember. It's a better word actually than memory itself, to remember. It's a practice. And that also refers a little to what you say. I haven't run across material focusing specifically on remembrance among perpetrators, but the same case would go there. You would have to go through that process of remembering in order to understand the past, even from the perpetrator's side. I haven't read about it. I would be happy to read about it if you find some. But material like you're referring to is probably part of it.
Are there other questions, comments?
That's the
Okay,
question, yes.
go ahead.
And yes, and Mr. Samir Katorji told me the bits and pieces of the memories of Sayfo, and even he was in High Syrian. But when people get out of the sort of the community in Syria and immigrated abroad, they are more free to talk about these kind of things. That's the one thing so we can sort of look at, yes. And also, and one thing is why they hide this memory or they try to forget the memory of Sayfo is the sort of the integration of the community. After the immigration to Syria, the whole sort of the memory of the community's reconstruction is how they get together and work together to build the community. And without that kind of the narratives, we cannot have a guess why they forget or to try to forget the memory of Sayfo. And of course, the situation is totally different, as you said. And if I can do research among the High Syrian community, that might have, I can collect some different kind of memories. But actually, many people have already forgotten most of the things, and therefore, only the bits and pieces, fragment of memories, we can collect from them. Not entire picture, I suppose.
The gentleman at the right has a question.
All right, I have a question about raised by the last two panels. It seems to me there's two ways of adapting to this kind of a crisis or a catastrophe. One is you can say, well, we had some difficulties in the past, but we've moved to a new area and we're doing well. We're in accordance with the local people, and that could explain some of the literature that we see that is somewhat oblique and metaphorical and not directly addressing the past. On the other hand, you could have the Iraqi woman that you interviewed who is suspicious to the point of almost paranoia. And how do people decide between these two strategies? Is it to some extent biological? Like, to what extent is your brain, introverted or extroverted or something like that? Or is it social or something else?
I don't think there are any comparisons in comparing these different populations as you refer to. I'm sure the genetic and the biological conditions are very important. But secondly, also the social circumstances, depending on society you live in, the historical background, your upbringing, upbringing in terms of education, etc. And of course also personal characteristics. So the two patterns you pointed are definitely very, very interesting, but you would probably have to take into consideration the social, the milieu, the environment they are being upbringed in. Well, maybe you would have to develop that if you want more discussion about that later. Thank you.
I just want to say something about memory, since my whole book is based on my mother's memory. I just heard something fairly recently about how memory works, and what they said was that when one keeps the memory inside, it stays intact. Once it's delivered, there's a possibility that it begins to change. And because my mother never really spoke about what happened for all of those years before I wrote the book, she described things that she hadn't seen, for instance, for 80 years when I started to write it. And she described even artifacts. And when we went to Greece, we found the exact same artifacts, the exact size, everything was so perfectly described, even though she hadn't seen it for 80 years. And I know a very prominent Holocaust, or rather genocide scholar, he calls himself, but he was doing memory research with Holocaust survivors, because he's Jewish. And he felt that they lied to him oftentimes. And I tried to tell him, I don't know that they lied. I think once they begin to congregate with their own people, my mother was isolated from her people all of those years. Once they begin to hear each other's stories, I think the stories sometimes get contaminated so that they're not purely their own story. And so they get a little bit confused.
Mm-hmm. Maybe before I give the word to the next speaker, to follow up on this, because in psychology and psychiatry, there is this problem of the fabrication of memory, things that have not happened and that are in one way or another fabricated under influence of the interviewer, but also under influence of treatment. How to tackle this problem in this context? Maybe both of you could briefly respond to that.
Well, that is probably, just very short, I mean, that is probably very true, but on the other hand, as psychologists, we also have to ask ourselves, well, it doesn't matter, we're not looking for the ontological level, right, whether that exists or not. Mm-hmm. But what we are interested in, how, whatever that is you have in your past, how does that affect the situation today? So, I mean, we can actually get rid of that question in a way in order to be able to study what is right here and now. Mm-hmm. So we're not addressing that issue, and I don't think you have to do that. Mm-hmm. You can actually leave that aside. Whether it's constructed, fabricated, don't get stuck there. Mm-hmm. Let's deal with how does that affect the situation today, and that is a relevant question.
Yeah. Okay. Next one.
Yeah, just a simple question. Because you mentioned the two young Armenian scholars who didn't know about other ethnic groups in Anatolia. I just want to know your analysis. You've been an activist for over 10 years, I think. How do scholars of Armenian genocide approach Sayfo?
This is a very good question, and it wasn't that Armenians didn't know. These two scholars that I went to there in 2003 that didn't know that the Greeks and Assyrians existed in Asia Minor, neither one was Armenian, actually. One was French, and the other one I think was American. And when we went to the plenary that night, he became very angry. The Frenchman became very angry at one of the Armenian scholars because he felt that I think he studied with him, and he felt that he lied to him, and then he made a fool of himself by not knowing that they even existed. The Armenians traditionally, so far, although it's changing dramatically, I hope, have really not been very receptive to having anyone else share the spotlight of the genocide. They've wanted to make it an exclusive genocide. And in fact, in 2005, because of what I learned in 2002 at 3 in the IAGS, I wrote a paper called The Exclusivity of Suffering, when tribal concerns takes precedence over historical truths. And I gave this, and this began the catalyst to the 2007 resolution, because Adam Jones heard my paper, invited me to Yale to give my paper to a group of scholars, and then suggested that we sit down and write a resolution, which we did, to present to the IAGS to recognize the Greeks and the Assyrians as comparable to the Armenian genocide, which we did. And when we did present that, those scholars that worked for the Armenians taught the Armenian genocide, and some of the Armenians really fought hard against this. They wanted to pull the resolution before a vote, because they knew if they had a vote, it would pass, of course. And it was a big struggle, and there was a lot of bruises that that we had to really pound on these people to force them to let the resolution go through and allow a vote. And when they did allow the vote, it passed overwhelmingly.
I have a question to Thea. You mentioned that during my question is to you, Thea. You mentioned that during the expulsion of the Greeks, also Armenians and small numbers, I think you mentioned 1,000, of also Assyrians were involved that I have never heard about. What is the source for this?
At the moment, I don't have the source with me. I don't have the thing, but I can get it for you if you want to email me. But this was, these were 1.2 million supposedly were transported to Greece, and 1,000 of them supposedly Assyrians at that time. And I hadn't realized at the time that I hadn't realized at the time that there were Assyrians in Smyrna. And so I'm not sure that they were coming right from Smyrna, because a lot of them were from there, but they were also from all over the country, I think.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Go ahead.
Well, this is rather an additional, a co-statement to what Tia Halu just mentioned. I would like to, for justice sake, to say that increasingly Armenians acknowledge that there were co-sufferers, and again, that is now for all scholars a question of reinterpreting whether this was an all-Christian genocide of the Ottomans or whether these were singular, not related events. I think we agree that it's an all-Ottoman genocide against Christians.
You want to address this to all three speakers, or maybe one of them?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I would like to remind you that just recently the Armenian parliament has issued the acknowledgement of the genocide against Aramaic speakers and also against Pontic Greeks, sadly, because it was not only Pontus Greeks, it was a genocide where the perpetrators did not differentiate whether an Ottoman Greek was from Pontus or not. Yes, these things are changing, and the genocide, the Armenian Genocide Museum and Institute has long ago dedicated its work also to the genocide against Assyrians. Dr. Khosroyeva would be a walking example with a doctoral thesis that was defended in Yerevan and received a presidential award. Mm-hmm. So please let us be careful and let us keep in mind that when genocide becomes serial, as the two genocides in the two world wars of last century, when they become serial, there is always a tendency of rivalry, jealousy, envy among victim groups. But this should be replaced by solidarity, and as far as scholars are concerned, it can be avoided when being comparative.
Thank you.
I'd like to, can I just add to that?
Sure.
As I said, that this is changing in the Armenian community. In fact, the president of Zoyan Institute, George Sherinian, has been moderating a lot of the genocide conferences that the Pontians are putting together. And they're putting together conferences that include the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Assyrians in these conferences. And George Sherinian is moderating them, and he's also editing the books. And he's finally come around from saying this resolution should never have happened. It was just because Thea Halo bullied everybody, to now writing the introductions to some of the books that are being produced and talking about the Greek genocide. So it is changing very dramatically. I'm very happy to know.
Thank you. Maybe one of you still want to respond to this issue? No, you're fine? Okay, go ahead.
I just want to follow up your point, which was very good, and you do see a pecking order if you think of the publicity surrounding the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. I think many people fail to realise that there were a whole multiplicity of groups. So that is just very interesting. I'm not suggesting it is right, but you do seem to get a pecking order, and it's good that initiatives are being taken to try to redress the balance. But somehow that does seem to occur, and you're quite right in saying there seems to be, unfortunately, some sort of rivalry for top dog place, if we say so.
Exactly, and also the Armenians felt that they had done so much work that they didn't want to then share all of that with other groups, because they had done an extraordinary amount of work in getting recognition.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. If there are no urgent questions, then I propose that we stop so that we have a little more time, or a little time for a break before we start the next session. So no urgent questions. Okay, thank you again for your presentation. Thank you for your attendance.